Hey everybody, it's time to do some more AP World History Modern review for your AP test that is coming up pretty soon, a lot sooner than we realize, I think. Hey, my name is Mason Logereau, coming to you live from Pflugerville, Texas in the Austin area. By the way, kind of say a little thing about Pflugerville before we start, because yesterday, Mr. Smith made a couple of claims about Pflugerville that I'm going to argue against. I will say this. When I moved to the Austin area about 25 years ago, Pflugerville was way out there. It was a lot of farmland. But as Austin has grown over the last 25 years, it's definitely become part of the city. And I absolutely love it. In fact, if you can't tell today, I've got all my Panther pride on. I got the hat. I've got my Pflugerville tennis shirt because I used to coach tennis. And you can't see it, but I'm actually even wearing Pflugerville Panther shorts today. I didn't have the socks because I have some socks, but they're dirty. I should have done a load of laundry before this, but that was my mistake. Anyway, absolutely love Pflugerville. It's an amazing community, an extremely diverse community, and I love it because that means that I can get like any type of food that I want. If I drive down some of the main streets of Pflugerville, I can get Tex-Mex and Vietnamese and German food because, of course, the Pflugers are the German family that settled it. And, of course, barbecue because that's what we do in Texas. Another fun fact about Pflugerville, and that's fact with a PFACT because, we're Pflugerville and we got to put the P in front of everything. If you ever watch the TV show Friday Night Lights, they filmed the entire first season in our football stadium. So I've been actually rewatching it with my son. It's become our binge show since we're in quarantine right now. And it's fun seeing our stadium and gym and all those shots. But enough about Pflugerville because that's probably not why you came to listen today. But I just want to give a shout out to the city and the school district as well, including the other schools in Pflugerville. So good to see you guys, Conley and Hendrickson and Weiss as well. Okay, last night, I was in a meeting with other AP World History teachers about the actual test day itself. And I wanted to go over a few things with you just to make sure you're aware of what's going to happen on the day of the AP test. I'm not going to go through all the information shared in that meeting because, oh my, there was a lot of information shared in that meeting. If I shared everything with you right now, we'd be here for the next 3 hours, and nobody wants that. But there are a few highlights that I'm going to hit with y'all. If you have any questions at all, you have got to talk to your teacher or the AP coordinator at your school and figure that out soon, like by next week, because of course AP tests are going to start the week after that. So this kind of goes for any AP test that you're taking, whether it's world history or another one. The only thing you need to be careful of is if you're taking one of the foreign language tests, Spanish or French or German or what have you, they have different setups and rules. So you need to talk to your teacher about that. Or if you're in one of the courses that requires a portfolio, like computer science principles or one of those, they've got different requirements as well. So if you're in one of those, talk to your teacher. Otherwise, if you're taking any other AP test, make sure you know these rules. Okay. All right. First off, you're going to get an email a couple days before the test with a special entry code and link that is just for you. And if you don't get the email, that's okay because you can log into My AP on the College Board site and also get your code that way. But the reason why I bring that up is because that code is just for you. Do not share it with anyone. If you can't find yours, don't go borrow your friends, because if you do, that's going to cause some very serious issues down the line. Make sure you're only using the link that was sent to you with your name on it. Also, you need to log in about 30 minutes before the test. Our test, the world history one, is at 1 p.m. Central. So if you're in the Central time zone like me, you need to log in around 12:30 or so. A couple of reasons why you need to log in early. One, you want to make sure all your equipment and everything is set up and everything's good to go. You got power in your laptop, all that good stuff. And there are going to be some security questions you have to answer just to basically prove that you are you before you take the test and that you didn't, pull in a friend or a sibling or a parent or something to take the test for you. So just make sure you are there 30 minutes before the test starts and you're ready to go. Also, number 3 is extremely important, and hopefully you realize it, but in case you don't, make sure everybody in your house knows you're taking an AP test and make sure they understand the importance of the test, and so they keep the noise levels down. Okay, listen, I understand noisy houses. I've got 2 small boys in this house and I've got 2 giant dogs. So yeah, it's hard sometimes to get peace and quiet, but make sure everybody knows that. Also, depending on your like internet connection situation, if you've got kind of slow Wi-Fi, you might want to tell everybody else to get off the Wi-Fi as well, so they're not taking up bandwidth. In fact, I have to do that when I teach this course at 5 o'clock each day. I have to tell my kids off the TV, no more streaming, off the laptops, all of that. So just make sure everybody in your house is prepared and ready and knows you're taking this test. Okay, when you log in to the testing site, you're going to have kind of 3 different ways that you could submit your DBQ once you've written it. The first is the one that I would recommend. I think it's probably the easiest and the most straightforward. And that is when you're typing up your DBQ, type in another program, either Microsoft Word, Google Docs, something like that. When you finish, you highlight it all, copy and paste it over to the College Board site. There'll be an entry to copy and paste it into there. You can also type in another program, save it like as a doc file, and then there'll be a space where you can upload the file if you want to do that. But honestly, I think copy and pasting is just going to be a whole lot easier. Or remember that you are allowed to handwrite your essay if you want. If you're going to do it, please make sure it's in like dark ink. Technically, you can do it in pencil. They are allowing it. But I'll just tell you right now, I've been a reader. I've tried to grade these essays before. It's hard to grade it if it's in a kind of a lighter ink or in pencil. And you want your reader in a good frame of mind when they're reading your essay. Having a nice dark ink makes them happy, and that's a good thing. But anyway, if you write it out, when you're done, you'll be able to take pictures of it, and then you can upload those pictures on the site as well, and there'll be directions for all of that. Okay, a lot of my students, and I've heard from other teachers as well, have been asking, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if my internet goes down at 12:58, 2 minutes before the test starts? There's all kinds of things that could possibly go wrong. If something goes wrong, it's okay. Don't worry about it, because remember, there is going to be a makeup test a couple of weeks later. So if something happens and you can't take the test on the day you're supposed to, that's fine. There'll be a makeup test later on. Again, though, talk to your teacher about the details about what that really means. If something messed up, you need to talk to them about what that means to get more details on it. But you will have a chance for a makeup test. But what that really also means is all of y'all need to take the test on the day, the normal day of the test. Because again, if something goes wrong, you have a chance for the makeup. But if something goes wrong the day of the makeup test, well, that's going to be an issue. So make sure you're taking the test on the normal day, please. Okay. But if it's something small that happens, like maybe your internet just goes out and comes back in, that's fine. Refresh the page, you'll be okay. Or if you accidentally close your browser, that's fine. You can log back in with your code and you'll be okay. But if something really bad happens, like the internet goes out for the next hour, then you will have a chance for a makeup exam. Also, remember that yes, this year this test is open notes, open textbook. But as Smith and I have been mentioning throughout the last couple of weeks, you only have 45 minutes to write a DBQ. You're not going to have a lot of time to search through your notes and search through your textbook. So yes, if you want them there, that is fine. If that helps you, great. But, and this is a big but, keep in mind, you cannot obviously talk to your friends, you cannot talk to your parents, you cannot use social media, you cannot collaborate with anyone on the test. The College Board will know if you're doing that. They have checks in place. They're looking for plagiarism. They're looking for essays that look similar, things like that. Do not even think about talking to anyone else during the test. Also, make sure you're not joking about it on social media, because yes, those jokes, I mean, if you are just joking, there is going to be, the College Board is going to look into that. So just don't joke about it. Don't think about it. Use your textbook if you like, use your notes, but no talking to anybody else. Also, if you're a little kind of confused about what the site's going to look like and how you're going to test, the College Board is going to have a demo site opened up next week on Monday. So you'll be able to take a look at that. And in fact, I would highly, highly encourage you at some point next week, log in and take a look at the demo site. Because again, writing a DBQ in 45 minutes is hard enough. You've got a big challenge ahead of you. Okay, I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say, it's easy. It's tough. It really is. And you know that. So let's not make it tougher by worrying about things like, what does the website look like? Where do I upload it? Where's the button to press this and all that? Go through, make sure you understand exactly what the site looks like, make sure there's no worries. If there's any questions, again, talk to your teacher or talk to the AP coordinator on your campus. Get all that figured out next week, and then you'll be ready to take the test. So on test day, all you have to worry about is writing your DBQ. Okay, again, that's not everything you need to know. I kind of hit the highlights, but make sure you're talking to your teacher or your AP coordinator at school to get the rest of the details. All right, so what are we doing today? Well, yesterday, Smith spent a long time talking about European imperialism and encroachment in Africa and South Asia. Today, we're going to look at countries and regions that were not directly imperialized, but were most definitely affected by industrialization and imperialism, specifically China and the Ottoman Empire. And then I also want to work on drawing connections between different events and processes in history. Because really, guys, the point I've been trying to get across these last several review sessions, and Smith is trying to get across, and your teacher as well. History is not just rattling off a bunch of facts and dates and people and all that. To truly get a deeper understanding of what happened in the past, you've got to be able to make those connections between events, whether it be comparing, contrasting, or looking at continuities and changes over time, or causes and effects. You've got to understand those deeper relationships. And when you start digging and really understanding it, you realize that history is a lot messier than we think. It doesn't happen in a straight line. Okay, I know that we use timelines a lot in history, and they do help to kind of simplify things. But we also need to realize that history is not always quite as simple as we put forward. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But really, by the time it's all over, I want you to really understand the major processes of the 19th century and how they all impacted each other. And by major processes of the 19th century, I mean imperialism, industrialization, and also urbanization. All right, before we get to that, last night, Smith asked y'all to write a paragraph making a claim about how people of Africa responded to European imperialism in the late 19th century. And he gave you 3 documents to do it with. He asked for some sourcing as well as evidence beyond the documents for it. So this is the paragraph that he wrote up. Take a second to look over it as I go through it. But notice in the first sentence, he's got his claim. He says, if we look at the responses of the people of Africa, some are trying to make mutually beneficial deals, others are violently rebelling. So actually, he's making kind of 2 claims there, which is great as well. For the first claim, he uses document 1. He shows that, hey, this is an agreement between African rulers and the British government to give the British some control over those areas of West Africa. But it was an attempt by those in Africa to try and get the best deal that they could. And if you just read over the document, it seems like it's going to be beneficial to both the British and the people of Africa. But when you go a little deeper into it, you think about the sourcing. And we got to remember the source of this is the British government. And we know the British government is looking to exploit this region for natural resources, human resources, and others. And so you got to kind of think about, hey, was this really mutually beneficial? Spoiler alert, the answer is no, it was not. Okay. Smith goes a little bit further, though, with his evidence beyond the document and gives another example of a treaty that the British signed in Nigeria to expand British territory as well. So again, even here's an extra support of another time that a European government made an agreement with rulers in Africa. Okay, remember, that's what you're trying to do with outside evidence. You're, again, trying to prove your claim, but giving other evidence or other examples. And then in the last couple sentences, he uses documents 2 and 3 to show that, yes, there were violent rebellions by Africans against European imperialism. But also notice here, he really just spends 1 sentence in each document showing that that supports the claim he made in the first sentence. And if you can make a solid claim in that topic sentence, that first sentence of your paragraph, it doesn't take a whole lot of writing to then show, here's how the documents support your claim. If you can be real concise in your writing and don't, spend a lot of time trying to kind of BS your way through it, you can get this down pretty quickly and get those points pretty quickly within a sentence or two for each document, as long as there's not a whole lot of filler in there. All right, so let's start thinking about global economic interconnectedness, the world coming together economically in the 19th century, whether some people want it to or not. And let's think about the role that industrialization plays in all of this. When you think about countries that have fully industrialized, whether they be the major powers of Europe, like England and Germany, whether it be the United States, or again, remember even later, Japan is able to modernize and industrialize pretty quickly, and they're about to get in on this imperialism stuff as well. But nations that have begun to industrialize are really looking for three major things. The first is natural resources. Okay, you have talked about natural resources all year long in your class, and we've talked about them a lot in these review sessions. Desire for natural resources is sort of a continuity that we see throughout history, beginning with the earliest civilizations. Now, the resources themselves certainly change, but there's always been this desire for things underground, or in some cases, I guess, above the ground as well. But remember, when we're talking about natural resources, whether it be something like silver and gold, or oil, or coal, or just water, well, they're not spread evenly across the globe. Some areas have them, some areas don't. It's why we have long distance trade. It's why we have conflict over these resources as well. Remember, back in the very early ancient civilizations, there was conflict over water and farmable, arable land. Later on, there's long distance trade, but also conflict over things like gold and silver, or silk that comes from silkworms. Hey, y'all remember that thing? It's called the Silk Road. It's like really big and long and stretches across Asia. Oh yeah, because they traded a lot of silk on it. Oh yeah, that's kind of a natural resource. Huh. Yeah, notice how you're making that connection. Good work. Now we get into the 19th century. The big things with the Industrial Revolution are, of course, iron that can be made into steel, coal that's going to power machine engines and trains and steamships. In the 20th century, obviously, oil is going to be a big one as well. But again, if you're an industrialized country, if you're going to have large machines building manufactured goods for you, well, you've got to have natural resources to power it. Or if you're trying to make clothing and textiles, well, you got to have the input. You got to have cotton, another natural resource. Or I told you on Tuesday, we were going to talk about bird poops today. So let's do that really quickly. And actually, the technical name is guano, G-U-A-N-O. So if you're going to write about this in your DBQ, please use the word guano. It's probably not advisable to use the word bird poop in your essay, but I guess if, you have like this brain fart in the middle of the essay and you can't remember the term guano, I suppose if you put feces or poop, I guess that'll work. But let's try and keep it to that. We don't need to see any other four-letter words that could also describe it, if you catch my drift. But actually, bird and bat guano, which sounds really dumb, you're like, why are we talking about this? Was actually an extremely important natural resource in the 19th century. Because remember, farmers for centuries had been using, animal droppings, or what you want to call it, for farming. It has nitrogen in it. It helps crops grow. Well, bird guano has that, and actually has it in very large amounts. The problem is it's kind of hard to collect that. Yes, birds drop it from the sky and sometimes it lands on your clothes, but you can't really collect it. But you start to see the discovery of little islands in the Caribbean, also in the South Pacific, also like off the coast of South America, that are uninhabited islands. We're talking about extremely tiny islands. You wouldn't even see them on maps because they're so small, sometimes even less than a square mile. They're more just like rocky outcrops out of the ocean. Nobody lives there or anything like that. But birds have been there for a really long time, and they've been pooping for a really long time. And there's large collections of guano on these islands. And you actually see the United States and some other countries as well claiming these really tiny islands just to get the guano. They would send large ships of laborers to these islands just to collect the guano and get on the ship. Is collect the right word? Do you mine guano? Do you excavate it? I don't know what the verb is there. I'm supposed to be using, but y'all get the point, right? And really, if you think about that type of work, that is a really just terrible job to have. I said the other day that mining work is probably some of the worst work you could do, but I think trying to collect bird poop and put it on a boat and then have to stay on that boat and sail back to the mainland, yeah, I would prefer not to do that. Okay, but anyway, the point is natural resources are huge in this. Speaking of guano and crops and food, also food for urban areas. We talked about urbanization. Cities are growing. Populations of countries that are industrializing are also growing. Well, with a growth in population, of course, means a growth in demand for food because people need food. But it's hard to grow food in urban areas. Some of you might have a little garden or something in your backyard, but a small backyard garden is not going to feed whole cities. Plus, as cities begin to grow, that means less farmland in those industrialized countries. So there is the need for food. And so you start to see food being exported from areas like South Asia and Africa and sent to Europe, to the United States, to Japan, to other industrialized areas. Part of it is because there's a need for food, obviously, but part of it is also just a desire for foods from around the world. You know, I mean, we don't really think about these days in 2020 where our food comes from. We go to the grocery store and we just grab it. But remember, there's only certain types of foods that grow in certain areas. And for a long time in history, if there was a food that did not grow in your area, you probably weren't going to get it. But now with steamships and trains and all that, you can move food around the globe very quickly before it goes bad and spoils. And so transportation of food becomes really important in this time as well. And then the other big one that we mentioned the other day, but I do want to bring up again, is if you're an industrialized country and you have factories that are producing all these goods, well, you got to have markets to sell them in. You know, think about if you're a factory owner in England, and let's say your factory makes, I don't know, wagon wheels or something like that. Okay, if you're going to sell wagon wheels to all the people in your area, cool. You can probably make a decent amount of money doing that. But at some point, you're going to sell all the wagon wheels that you possibly can. If everybody's got them, you're going to reach a limit to how much money you can actually make. You have to find new markets to sell those in. Well, with imperialism, remember that opens up new markets to sell goods in. Consider what the British were doing in India. Remember, one of the most hated laws by the people of India were the salt laws, where the British government forced the people of India to only buy salt from British companies. In fact, it was one of the things that Gandhi protested about in the 20th century, that people of India, it was actually illegal to even make your own salt. You had to buy it from British merchants. But again, that's industrialized companies trying to open up those markets so they can sell their goods. All right, so this is where imperialism comes in, like Smith talked about yesterday. If you're an industrialized country and you go and, overseas and you open up a new colony and take over, you get all these things. You get the natural resources, you get the food, and you get markets for your goods. So you need to understand the relationship between industrialization, urbanization, and imperialism, because all three of them go together and kind of drive each other. Remember also that industrialization is giving these countries the means to imperialize. Okay, just consider how difficult it is to take your army, send it halfway across the world, invade a country, take it over, and then control it. Controlling it's probably even the hardest part. Well, if you have machine guns and trains and telegraphs, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier. And all of those things are possible only because of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, think about it. Machine guns have to be made by a, you guessed it, machine. There's a lot of parts that have to be the exact size. Bullets have to be a very specific size. You can't make those by hand. They have to be mass produced. So again, notice that the Industrial Revolution gives these countries a military advantage. It gives them the means to imperialize. In fact, this picture here on the right is of a ceremony on the Trans-Siberian Railroad that the Russians built going across all of Asia to the Pacific Ocean to kind of cross Siberia. That helped the Russians to expand their empire all the way into East Asia, all the way to the Pacific. So what you need to realize through all of this, through industrialization, through imperialism and all that, is that there are now regions of the world that are being dragged into the global economy, even if they don't want to be. Or in some cases, regions that had already been part of the global economy. I mean, take India. We know that India has been an important part of Indian Ocean trade for several hundred years before this. Hey, did y'all realize that India is close to the Indian Ocean? Hopefully you did. That's going to help you with geography on this test in a couple weeks. But now India is still part of this trade, but they're an extreme economic disadvantage because they've been taken over by the British government and the British East India Company. All right, so like I said, Smith talked a lot about imperialism yesterday, did a great job with that. But today I want to look at also economic imperialism. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of economic imperialism, and then we'll kind of define it, and then we'll talk about similarities and differences between that and imperialism. Probably the most famous example of economic imperialism that you studied in class was the British in China and the Opium Wars. Remember that as Europeans began exploring the Indian Ocean in the 15th and 16th centuries and tried to open up different markets all along the Indian Ocean, China kind of closed itself off to European merchants. There were very strict regulations on ports that European merchants could trade in, only certain things they could sell, etc. And you see European countries, especially the British, attempting so many times to open up those Chinese markets, again, wanting to sell their goods in China, and just were not able to. And then in the 1800s, remember at this point, the British control India. Of course, India shares a border with China. In India, you grow a lot of poppies. Poppies can be used and turned into opium, a narcotic drug. Okay, first off, don't ask me how you turn poppies into opium, because one, I don't know. Two, if I did, I don't think it'd be appropriate to share it on a video with College Board to a bunch of high school students. That seems like a really bad idea. I am not Walter White. This is not Breaking Bad. I am not going to become a high school teacher turned drug kingpin. So let's just understand poppies become opium. That's easy enough for us. British merchants start taking that opium, smuggling it across the border into China, and selling it to the people in Western China. And then you remember the story, right? The Chinese government decides to crack down on it. The emperor sends Commissioner Lin to crack down. The commissioner seizes a large supply of British opium and arrests some British merchants that are in China. And that's the excuse the British use to go to war with China. It is an extremely flimsy excuse, right? The Chinese were just simply trying to crack down on illegal drugs in their country, but the British decided to make a big deal out of it and call it an act of war. And really, it was just an excuse, again, to open up Chinese markets. And so you have a series of wars between the Chinese and the British, and then later the French and Germans, even Japanese kind of jump in, and that series of wars is known as the Opium Wars. Now, a couple things I want you to remember. First off, the British were not looking to take over all of China. China was way too big, way too many people. That would be nearly impossible. It would not be worth it to the British Army. But the British and the Germans and the French and the Japanese as well got what they wanted. You see parts of China being carved up into spheres of influence. Different ports that are opened up, the natural resources there can be taken back to Europe, etc. But one thing to keep in mind, China was never completely taken over. China remained China through the whole thing. Yes, you have the Opium Wars, you have the Boxer Rebellion later. The Qing Dynasty does collapse in the early 1900s, which again, remember, you don't have to need to know because it won't be on the test because it happens after 1900. But still, there's a new Chinese government that replaces it. China remains China. It was not completely taken over, but many parts of it were carved out. Or another example of economic imperialism is the United States and their role in politics and economics of Latin America. Remember, by the 1800s, or at least the late 1800s, the United States was the main economic superpower in the Western Hemisphere, the one fully industrialized country. And the United States government begins to use that economic and political power and military power to get their way in Latin America. One example of that is the Panama Canal. Okay, you're familiar with the canal that goes through Panama that links the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Makes it a lot easier for ships to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa, because you don't have to sail all the way around South America. But do you know the story of how it was created? Because remember, in the late 1800s, Panama was actually a part of Venezuela. But the Panamanian people were looking to rebel, to gain independence, to start a new country. And the United States government decides to help out the Panamanian people. Not because we're like nice people or all that, no. There was an economic advantage. And so the United States Navy sent down a couple of battleships and parked them right on the shore of Venezuela, basically daring the Venezuelan military, come on, do something. You know, we've got these giant ships waiting for you. The Venezuelans back down. The Panamanians gain their independence. Panama is now a new independent country. And because the United States helped out, the United States now controls the area where the Panama Canal is going to be built. So notice, it wasn't the United States didn't have to go to war, they didn't invade, but they definitely fluxed their military muscle to get what they wanted for economically. You see there, the cartoon with Teddy Roosevelt, because he was president, was one of the main drivers behind all of this. And the United States actually owned that zone of the Panama Canal up until the 1970s. Okay, so notice in economic imperialism, it's not that countries are being completely taken over like we saw in Africa or South Asia. But in both imperialism and economic imperialism, we see a desire for natural resources and markets, like we talked about already. We see military force being used, or at least the threat of military force. But imperialism involves political control of an area, moving in and taking over completely. Economic imperialism usually did not mean that. Yes, there were certain parts of China that were taken over by European powers. Yes, the United States owned part of Panama, but didn't take over the entire country. So make sure you kind of understand, when we talk about imperialism, there's different types of it. It looks different in different regions. Make sure you understand those differences, but also the similarities. All right, let's do a little practice with that and a little contextualization. Because as I've been talking about, when you're trying to get these historical events and processes and trying to figure out the connections, contextualization is a good place to show off your knowledge of these. Because remember, with contextualization, you kind of start with the big picture and you narrow it down to be specific about the topic of the prompt. So if I gave you this essay question, to what extent did European imperialism differ in Africa and East Asia? So think imperialism versus economic imperialism. I want you to take a second, pause the video, and write a couple of sentences. What would be the opening sentences of your essay? What would be your contextualization? Remember, you don't need to get into the argument here. You don't need to give me the similarities and differences between imperialism in Africa and East Asia. But what's your context? What are the big picture ideas you have to understand before you get into the essay? All right, so go ahead and pause for a couple minutes, write it out. I'll be here when you get back. Okay, I'm back, or you're back, I should say. But possible answers you could write. No matter what you wrote, you probably had something about the Industrial Revolution or industrialization. But notice what I wrote here, two things. One, desire for natural resources and new markets, because we've already talked about that's a similarity between what happened in Africa and East Asia. And then I also mentioned the military advantage, machine guns, trains. You could have also mentioned telegraphs. That was a big part of communication as well. Any or all of those would work great. But again, notice I start off with something big, industrialization, and then narrow it down to the topic. Industrialization leads to imperialism, whether it be economic or regular imperialism in these ways. By the way, speaking of trains, real quickly, take a look at this map. This is a map of all the train lines in Europe by 1880-ish or so. Now, when you look at this map, obviously the first thing that your eye looks at is, wow, there's a lot of trains in Northern Europe and Western Europe. And yeah, that makes sense. Those are the areas like England that were heavily industrialized. But what's almost just as important, take a look at where there are very few railroads. You know, like this area right here in southeastern Europe, where you see very few railroads. Wait a minute, Logero. Isn't that part of the Ottoman Empire? Yes, brilliant student, it is. So notice here the Ottoman Empire falling behind economically. But wait a minute, Logero, didn't the Ottoman Empire collapse towards the beginning of the 20th century? Yes, brilliant student, you're on fire today. The Ottoman Empire does collapse right after World War I. But even before that, in the late 1800s, they were already having problems. You do see some attempts by the Ottoman government to industrialize and modernize their empire. But frankly, it was just an issue of too little, too late. And so it eventually leads to the collapse of it. So again, I want you to understand the importance of railroads and industrialization when it comes to these issues. Even if you have an area like the Ottoman Empire that at the time was not taken over by anybody, well, they were losing some territory on the periphery, but still, they are being negatively impacted by industrialization because they're getting kind of left behind of the major European powers. All right, speaking of trains and railroads, time to do a little more historical claims here. I gave you a prompt here. Evaluate the extent to which railroads affected the process of empire building between 1860 and 1918. What I'd like for you to do is do a little practice on claims. I want you to pause the video, read the document, and then what would be the first sentence of the paragraph where you talk about this document? Okay, so go ahead and pause the video, read over it, write down a claim in 1 or 2 sentences. I'll be here when you're done. All right. One possible answer, you can keep this pretty simple. Hey, railroads were used by states and empires in order to strengthen their military because you can quickly move troops and equipment. That's exactly what this document's talking about. It's about the Trans-Siberian Railroad that I mentioned earlier, that Russia is now building a railroad all the way across its territory and its empire to the Pacific Ocean. That is going to help them mobilize troops and move them much quicker to front lines, depending on where they're fighting, or troops or equipment also. All right, let's do it one more time. Same prompt, different document this time. I want you to pause the video, read the document, write a claim. I'll be here when you get back. All right, here we have a British Army officer who's in India. Because don't forget, the British were building a lot of railroads in India, not to help the people of India, but to help the British keep control, also to help get resources out of India back to Europe. Now, his argument is that actually railroads can help foster identity, and also he doesn't say nationalism, but a sense of nationalism like we talked about the other day. And then of course, with nationalism, that does lead to loyalty for the empire. If the people of Britain all join together in nationalist ideas, that's loyalty to the British crown. And actually, he's right. You do see this in India. Of course, the problem is that as people are moving in trains and getting to know each other through different regions of South Asia, there's actually a growing Indian nationalism that is going to come back and bite the British in the rear after World War II when India gains independence. All right, so to quickly summarize, you've got to understand, if we're going to understand the 19th century at all, you've got to understand that industrialization and imperialism are completely intertwined, causing each other, reinforcing each other. Make sure you understand those key relationships there, okay? And really, again, make sure you understand the different types of imperialism, but realize that natural resources and markets are almost always the reason for imperialism. But really the biggest thing I want you to do is, as you really dive deep into understanding these relationships, make sure you understand that historical events do not happen in a straight line. They don't happen one at a time. You don't have, hey, here's industrialization, and then here's the era of imperialism, and we forget about industrialization. No, that's not how history works. It's all happening at the same time. That's one of the tough things about trying to teach history, and teachers across the country have said this before, is if you're reading the textbook and it's like, oh, you finished the chapter on industrialization. Okay, you take the test, you're done. Now you go to the chapter on imperialism and you learn about that. Well, that's not how history worked, right? Industrialization and imperialism are happening at the same time and reinforcing each other. There wasn't a break. No one woke up one morning and said, whew, we're done with industrialization, time to move on to imperialism. That never happened in the 1800s, okay? You've got to understand how this is all happening at once and how the people of the time experienced it as well. And remember, if you can show those connections, you can do it in your contextualization, you can do it in your outside information. If you have an essay about the Industrial Revolution, it might be possible to bring in some evidence on imperialism, depending on what the prompt is and all of that. And if you're really good at it, possibly some complex understanding if you can bring in multiple topics on it as well. But as we've talked about, that complex understanding is an extremely difficult point to get. Talk to your teacher about that, about possible ways that you could get that. All right, I got some homework for you. And actually, you know what? Today's kind of a bittersweet day for me because this is the last time I'm going to give you homework, because this is the last time that I'm going to be doing a review video with y'all. I've actually really have enjoyed this. But remember, Smith is going to be here tomorrow. He's going to finish up our reviews. But next week, I will be back, but we're not going to be doing things like we usually have. We're going to be doing some DBQ practice. So on Monday, when you come at 5 o'clock to watch this, I'm going to give you a DBQ. You're going to write it for 45 minutes, and I'm going to proctor it with you. I will be back with you on Tuesday to go over possible answers for the DBQ, what you could have written, thesis statements, contextualization, outside evidence, all that good stuff. I'll also be back next Friday. Smith and I are going to be together to give you some last minute tips. So it's not the last time you're going to see me, but it is the last time I'm going to do review with you and go over homework. All right, I put the file in the Google Drive. The link is right below me. I gave it the really creative title of 6.4 and 6.5 homework. It's actually the same DBQ prompt you were looking at there a second ago, but I've given you a few other documents. What I'd like for you to do, though, is I want you to work on your contextualization, because again, that's going to help those guys if you can do it next. And then I want you to come up with 2 pieces of outside evidence this time. You don't need the documents to make claims, but give 2 pieces of outside evidence that would be relevant to a claim that you could make for the prompt. Now, in order to understand what's not in the documents, you probably need to know what's in the documents. So make sure you look through the 5 documents I gave y'all. You don't need to like read them super carefully and analyze them, you know, word for word or anything, but make sure you at least know the topics of them so that you know what's not in them so you can write your outside evidence. And Smith will go over that with y'all tomorrow. And I will see you on Monday. Y'all have a good weekend. Bye.